A man thought he was saving a helpless puppy, abandoned on a rainy roadside. Its tiny body trembled in his hands, its oversized eyes begging for comfort. He wrapped it in his shirt, carried it home, and promised to protect it. But as days passed, strange behaviors emerged, sounds no puppy should make, movements far too sharp, eyes that glowed in the dark. Concerned, he rushed it to the vet. The doctor's face drained of color, his hands shaking as he whispered the truth. What the man had brought home was not a puppy at all, and the revelation shocked everyone who heard it. The rain had just begun to fall, a light drizzle tapping rhythmically against the windshield as Mark drove down the lonely country road. It was late, the kind of late where the world feels asleep, where every shadow on the roadside seems alive with possibilities. He was tired from a long day at work and eager to get home to his warm bed, but fate had other plans for him that night. Up ahead, something moved in the darkness. A small, dark shape trembled at the edge of the pavement, half hidden in the tall grass that lined the road. Mark slowed down, squinting through the rain-streaked glass. At first, he thought it might be a kitten, or perhaps just a piece of debris blown from the storm. But then the shape lifted its head, and two enormous glassy eyes reflected brilliantly in the beam of his headlights. His heart clenched with sudden emotion. It was tiny, fragile, and shivering uncontrollably in the cold rain. Mark muttered under his breath, pulling over quickly to the side of the road. He stepped out into the drizzle, rain dampening his shirt within seconds, and crouched low near the trembling creature. It was no bigger than the palm of his hand, with slick, jet-black fur plastered flat from the rain. Its ears looked too big for its small head, and its little body shook violently as if the cold night might swallow it whole at any moment. Mark's first thought was simple and immediate. Puppy. Someone had cruelly abandoned it, left it here to die alone in the wet grass. He felt anger rise sharply in his chest at the thought of such heartless cruelty toward an innocent creature. Mark whispered softly, carefully extending his hand toward the shivering animal. The creature did not bark, did not whimper in the way he expected. Instead, it let out the faintest squeak, almost like a kitten's cry, high-pitched and desperate. Its tiny claws clung desperately to Mark's fingers as he lifted it gently from the cold, wet ground. The weight, or rather the startling lack of it, nearly broke his heart in that instant. It could not have been more than a few weeks old, abandoned and helpless. Mark cradled it gently against his chest, shielding it from the falling rain with his body. The creature blinked up at him with wide, liquid eyes, as though recognizing in that moment that he was its only chance at survival. In that instant, something profound shifted inside him. He was not just picking up a stray animal from the roadside. He was rescuing a life, taking responsibility for something utterly dependent on his kindness. Back at his truck, Mark wrapped the trembling body carefully in an old flannel shirt he kept behind the seat for emergencies. He whispered reassuringly to the tiny creature, telling it that everything would be okay now, that it was safe. The puppy curled into the warmth of the fabric, its tiny pink tongue peeking out slightly as it drifted into an exhausted sleep, finally safe from the elements. The drive home felt surreal and dreamlike. Mark kept glancing at the bundle beside him on the passenger seat, his heart softening with every small breath the creature took. But as the minutes passed in the quiet truck, he could not shake one unsettling thought that kept returning to his mind. Something about this creature seemed different from other puppies he had seen. Its head was oddly shaped, more rounded than a typical puppy's skull. Its eyes were larger, darker, almost too expressive for such a young animal, and its movements, though weak from exposure, seemed unnervingly agile, as if it was not struggling to survive, but adapting, watching, learning about its new environment with unusual intelligence. Mark brushed the troubling thoughts aside, attributing them to exhaustion and heightened emotion clouding his judgment. After all, what else could it possibly be besides a puppy? Still, when he pulled into his driveway, the rain now falling heavier against the roof of his truck, he felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. Holding the bundle close to his chest, he whispered again, as much to himself as to the sleeping creature in his arms, promising that he would take care of it no matter what. As he stepped through the door into the warm glow of his home, he had absolutely no idea that this single act of kindness, rescuing what he genuinely thought was a helpless puppy, was about to unravel a mystery so shocking and disturbing it would leave even a seasoned veterinarian pale with fear. Mark placed the tiny bundle carefully on a soft towel in his living room, his hands moving with extreme caution, as if he were handling something made of delicate glass. The little creature stirred slightly, blinking against the sudden warmth and bright light of the house. Its enormous eyes glistened in the lamplight, reflecting back his own worried expression like dark mirrors. Mark murmured softly, gently stroking its damp fur with the corner of the towel, trying to dry it off. The creature squeaked again, soft and high-pitched, but nothing like the typical yip of a young puppy. It clutched the towel with surprising strength for something so small and vulnerable, curling its sharp claws into the fabric before finally relaxing somewhat in his gentle hands. Mark's heart melted at the sight of such vulnerability and trust. He set a shallow dish of warm milk on the floor, hoping desperately that the little one would take to it and regain some strength. The creature sniffed the air cautiously, wobbled forward unsteadily on weak legs, and then lapped at the liquid with surprising eagerness and coordination. Mark smiled with genuine relief washing over him. He watched for several minutes, his exhaustion temporarily forgotten. There was something oddly mesmerizing about the way the creature moved, light, almost silent, like a shadow flickering across the floor with supernatural grace. Its tail twitched rhythmically, its oversized ears twitching at every small sound in the house, from the hum of the refrigerator to the creak of floorboards. Even in its fragile state, it seemed unusually alert and aware, as though constantly studying and analyzing its surroundings with keen intelligence. By the time the little one finished drinking, its belly was full and round, swollen with the warm milk. It waddled back to Mark unsteadily, pressing against his leg affectionately. He reached down and lifted it carefully, surprised again by its delicate weight that seemed impossibly light. Without hesitation, the creature curled into his chest, tucking its tiny head beneath his chin in a gesture that seemed almost calculated to inspire protectiveness. Mark's throat tightened with emotion. He had not expected to feel so strongly. He had only known this creature for barely an hour, yet he already felt deeply protective, as if fate itself had deliberately placed this fragile life into his hands for a reason. That night, he made a small bed from a shoebox, lining it carefully with an old sweatshirt to make it as comfortable as possible. The creature nestled into it immediately, seeming content, but when Mark tried to step away to his own bedroom, it squeaked loudly and frantically, scrambling toward the edge of the box. Mark chuckled softly, lifting it back into his hands to comfort it. Against his better judgment and normal routine, he let it sleep curled on his pillow right beside his head. He lay awake for hours that night, listening to its tiny breaths, feeling its surprising warmth against his cheek. By morning, he had already given it a name that seemed to fit perfectly: Shadow. It seemed fitting for something so small and dark, a mysterious little companion who had appeared out of nowhere on a rainy night. As the days passed slowly, Shadow settled into the house as if it had always belonged there. But it was not like any puppy Mark had ever raised before in his life. Shadow did not bark or whine in the expected ways. Instead, it made odd chirping sounds, sometimes low and rumbling, sometimes sharp and piercing, always catching Mark's immediate attention. Its eyes seemed almost too expressive and knowing, following him wherever he went throughout the house. And unlike most clumsy pups learning to walk, Shadow did not stumble or fall as it grew more comfortable in its environment. Its movements were precise, fluid, almost cat-like in their grace and economy. One evening, while Mark read quietly on the couch, he felt eyes boring into him intensely. Looking down, he found Shadow perched on the armrest, staring at him with an intensity that made his skin prickle uncomfortably. The little creature tilted its head at an odd angle, ears twitching rapidly before letting out a sound that sent an involuntary chill down his spine. Not a bark, not a meow, but something disturbingly in between the two. Mark laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease. Despite the growing oddities, Mark's attachment grew stronger with each passing day. He took dozens of photos, shared them with friends online, who responded with confusion and concern. One friend texted back that it was the weirdest puppy they had ever seen. Another joked, asking if he was sure it was actually a dog at all. Mark brushed off their concerns dismissively. People simply did not understand the bond he had formed. Shadow was his responsibility now, his family. At night, Shadow proved increasingly restless and active. While Mark tried desperately to sleep, the creature often crept silently around the room, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness like twin embers. More than once, he awoke suddenly to find it perched at the foot of the bed, watching him intently. Strangely, he did not feel afraid during these moments. If anything, he felt oddly safe, as if being watched over. Each day, the bond between them deepened naturally. Mark carried Shadow everywhere he went, fed it carefully and attentively, even spoke to it as though it could fully understand human speech. And in a way, it genuinely seemed to comprehend his words. Its head would tilt at the sound of his voice, its tail flicking with clear recognition. But beneath the warmth of their growing bond lingered a persistent shadow of unease that Mark could not quite shake. The more time he spent with Shadow, the more certain he became of one troubling fact. This was not just an unusual puppy. It was something else entirely, something he could not quite name or identify, and soon, much sooner than he expected, he would learn the disturbing truth. At first, Mark convinced himself repeatedly that Shadow's quirks were simply part of being a young pup from an unusual breed. But as the days turned steadily into weeks, the little creature's oddities became increasingly harder to ignore or explain away. For one thing, Shadow never barked. Not once in all the time together. There were no playful yips, no whines for food, no excited greetings at the door when Mark came home. Instead, it made strange chirping sounds that echoed oddly in the quiet house, sometimes soft like a bird calling, sometimes sharp enough to make the hairs on Mark's arm stand up involuntarily. Each time it made these sounds, Shadow's wide black eyes fixed on him intently, almost as if testing his reaction to see how he would respond. Then there was the increasingly obvious way it moved through space. Unlike clumsy puppies that stumbled adorably as they grew into their bodies, Shadow was unnervingly graceful and coordinated. Its tiny body glided across the floor with fluid precision. Claws clicking softly but rhythmically against the wood, it could leap onto furniture far higher than Mark thought physically possible for its size and age. Once he watched in stunned silence as it scrambled up the back of the couch in a single fluid motion without any struggle, balancing perfectly on the narrow edge like a miniature predator surveying its territory from above. Friends who visited the house were quick to notice the abnormalities. One neighbor said cautiously, watching Shadow creep along the windowsill with unnatural balance, that it did not look like any puppy she had ever seen. She asked directly if Mark was sure he knew what that thing actually was. Mark laughed it off awkwardly, though unease prickled persistently at the back of his mind. He did not want to admit it out loud, but the truth was gnawing at him constantly. At night, the strangeness became completely undeniable. Shadow seemed most alive and active when the house went dark and silent. While Mark struggled to sleep peacefully, the creature prowled quietly from room to room with purpose. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, twin orbs that caught even the slightest glimmer of moonlight streaming through windows. More than once, Mark woke suddenly to find Shadow perched high on the dresser, staring down at him with unnerving intensity that sent chills through his body. Food presented another growing puzzle that worried Mark. Shadow refused dog kibble completely, no matter how Mark tried to disguise it or make it appealing. Milk and soft scraps worked reasonably well for a while, but then it began showing unusual and disturbing preferences, sniffing curiously at raw meat with obvious interest, even hissing faintly when Mark tried to pull it away from the refrigerator. Puppies did not hiss like that. Despite all these mounting red flags, Mark could not bring himself to turn away from the creature. The bond they had formed felt real and meaningful. Shadow still curled against his chest when he sat on the couch reading, still chirped softly when he came home from work, as if greeting him with genuine affection. But deep inside, Mark's worry grew steadily stronger. What if he was not caring for it properly? What if it was not even safe or legal for him to keep? The tipping point came one quiet evening when Mark carried Shadow outside to feel the grass beneath its paws for the first time. A neighbor's dog barked loudly from across the fence, aggressive and territorial. Shadow stiffened immediately, its tiny body trembling, not with fear as Mark expected, but with something much darker and more primal. It let out a low, guttural sound Mark had never heard before, a sound that did not belong to any puppy he had ever encountered. The barking dog went completely silent, tail tucked between its legs, backing away slowly without another noise, clearly frightened. Mark's stomach dropped sickeningly. He stood frozen in place, clutching Shadow tightly in his arms. For the first time since finding the little creature on that rainy roadside, he was not sure what he was actually holding in his hands. And that night, unable to ignore the mounting unease any longer, Mark made a firm decision. Tomorrow, he would take Shadow to the vet for a proper examination. The next morning dawned grey and heavy, as if the sky itself carried the weight of Mark's growing unease and dread. He placed Shadow gently into a small carrier lined with a soft blanket for comfort. The little creature chirped softly, wide eyes blinking up at him, as if somehow sensing that something was wrong. Mark swallowed hard against the lump in his throat. The drive to the clinic felt endless and agonizing. Every bump in the road rattled his already frayed nerves. He kept glancing nervously at the carrier beside him, where Shadow watched silently, too calm and observant for what should have been an energetic young puppy. By the time he pulled into the veterinary clinic's parking lot, Mark's palms were slick with nervous sweat. Inside the building, the waiting room buzzed with the usual chaos of a busy practice. Dogs barking loudly, cats meowing in carriers, the sharp smell of disinfectant heavy and clinical in the air. Mark sat in the corner, clutching the carrier close to his chest protectively. A little girl leaned over from across the room, pointing excitedly at Shadow, telling her mother to look at the tiny puppy. Her mother gave a polite smile, but frowned noticeably at the creature's enormous eyes and eerie, unnatural stillness. Mark offered a strained nod, shifting uncomfortably under their scrutiny. When his name was finally called, after what felt like hours, relief and dread crashed together violently inside him. He followed the nurse down a narrow hallway into a small examination room. The veterinarian, Dr. Harris, entered moments later, a kind-faced man with decades of experience visible in his weathered features. He asked warmly what they had there today. Mark lifted Shadow carefully out of the carrier, placing him gently on the cold examination table. The tiny creature blinked under the bright overhead light, ears twitching nervously. Dr. Harris leaned forward, his expression neutral at first as he began the examination. He commented that it looked very young indeed, then asked where Mark had found it. Mark explained quickly about finding it on the side of the road in the rain, how he thought it was a puppy someone had cruelly dumped, how he could not just leave it there to die. The vet did not respond right away to the story. He adjusted his glasses carefully, gently touching Shadow's head, then lifting one of its small paws for closer inspection, his brow furrowing deeply. He checked its teeth thoroughly, its ears, its claws with growing concern. The longer the examination went on, the more his face shifted visibly from initial curiosity to concern, then to something much colder and more troubling. Mark's heart began to race anxiously. Mark asked nervously if something was wrong with Shadow. Dr. Harris did not answer immediately, which only increased the tension. He stepped back from the table, staring down at the creature as if trying to process what he was seeing, as if struggling to believe it. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his clipboard. Shadow chirped suddenly, the strange sound echoing unnaturally through the sterile room. The vet froze completely, his pen slipping from his hand and clattering on the floor. Slowly, he looked at Mark, his face noticeably pale. He said quietly that Mark had told him he thought this was a puppy. Mark nodded quickly, confusion tightening painfully in his chest. He confirmed that yes, he believed it was a puppy. Dr. Harris's throat worked visibly as he swallowed hard. His voice was quieter now, edged with clear disbelief. He stated firmly that this was not a puppy. The room went completely dead silent. Mark blinked, the words not immediately sinking into his consciousness. He glanced at Shadow, who sat calmly on the metal table, staring back with those enormous, unblinking eyes that suddenly seemed more alien than ever before. For the first time since that rainy night, Mark felt a genuine chill crawl slowly up his spine. Mark asked, with his voice cracking slightly, what the vet meant by that statement. The vet did not answer immediately, seeming reluctant. He bent closer again to Shadow, almost reluctant to touch the creature a second time, as if it might be dangerous. His hands moved cautiously, as though he were handling something potentially harmful. Finally, he straightened up, his expression grave and serious. He said he needed to know exactly where Mark found this creature, every detail, right now. Mark's mouth went dry. His mind replayed the rain, the roadside, the moment he scooped the trembling figure into his arms, but nothing in those memories prepared him for the intensity in Dr. Harris's eyes. Whatever Shadow actually was, it was not what he thought at all. And the truth, Mark realized with a sinking heart, might be far more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. The silence in the examination room stretched painfully, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead fluorescent light. Mark shifted nervously, his eyes darting between Dr. Harris and the small creature perched calmly on the steel table. Shadow tilted its head at an odd angle, those wide black eyes glinting as if it somehow understood every word left unspoken in the tense air. Finally, the vet exhaled slowly, adjusting his glasses with unsteady hands that betrayed his anxiety. He said they needed to listen carefully to what he was about to tell them. This was not a puppy, not even close to being one. Mark blinked, the words sinking like heavy stones in his chest. He asked what it was then. Dr. Harris hesitated, as though saying it aloud would somehow make the truth heavier and more real. He leaned closer to the little creature, pointing at its oversized ears, its unusual jawline, the unnatural sharpness of its claws. He explained that puppies did not have features like these. Their eyes did not glow in this specific way. Their movements were not this precise and calculated. What Mark had brought here was not domesticated at all. It was wild. Mark's stomach dropped sickeningly. He asked if the vet meant like a fox. The vet shook his head grimly. No, not a fox, he clarified. Not any ordinary animal Mark would see roaming nearby in these parts. He straightened up, his face pale with concern. He told Mark directly that he had been keeping a predator in his house. The words crashed over him like thunder. He looked down at Shadow, still nestled calmly, its tiny chest rising and falling as though it were the most harmless thing in the entire world. Mark protested that this could not be right. It was just a baby. It needed help, desperately. Dr. Harris's gaze hardened with professional concern. He explained that was exactly what made it dangerous. Right now, Shadow was small, even defenseless. But in a few months, this creature could become lethal. Its instincts were not like a dog's at all. It was not wired to bond with humans in the way domestic animals were. Keeping it had been very risky. Mark's pulse thundered loudly in his ears. His hands trembled as he reached toward Shadow, torn between mounting fear and the fierce protectiveness that had grown inside him since that rainy night. Could it really be true? Had he mistaken a predator for a puppy? The vet's next words made his skin crawl uncomfortably. He said he had seen something like this before, just once. Authorities had confiscated an illegal exotic cub from wildlife traffickers. People thought they were pets when they were small and cute, but they grew fast, and they never forgot their true nature. He paused, swallowing hard. He asked where exactly Mark had found it. Mark's voice shook as he answered that it was on the roadside near the woods, completely alone. Dr. Harris exchanged a grim look with the nurse standing nearby. He said, if there was one cub, there might be more. And if its mother was out there somewhere, he trailed off, leaving the warning unspoken but clearly understood. Mark's heart pounded. He stared at Shadow, who appeared innocent and fragile, clinging to the towel like any lost creature seeking comfort and safety. Yet now every feature looked different to his eyes. The sharpness of its claws, the unnatural glint in its eyes, the strange, eerie sounds it made. It all made terrible sense. Shadow was not a puppy. He never had been. And the realization left Mark with a terrifying question he could not answer. What had he really brought into his home? The room felt colder now, though nothing had physically changed except the weight of Dr. Harris's disturbing words. Mark sat frozen, his gaze locked on Shadow, who nestled quietly on the towel, licking its paws with eerie calm and precision. He wanted desperately to see just a puppy, but the truth had cracked the illusion wide open. Dr. Harris pulled up a chair and leaned forward, his expression grim but patient. He said Mark needed to listen very carefully. What he had been raising was not a dog. It was a cub, likely from a wild species. Based on the specific features, he would say it was a young wolf, or possibly something even rarer, maybe even an exotic predator that had been smuggled into this region illegally. Mark's mouth went completely dry. He repeated the word wolf, which felt foreign on his tongue, impossible to connect with the fragile creature curled at his side. He protested that this did not make any sense. Wolves did not just show up on roadsides around here. The vet agreed that he was right, which was precisely why this worried him so much. If it was a wolf pup, then its mother may have been nearby or worse, killed. Wolves were extremely protective, and they did not leave their young behind without serious reason. He paused, his eyes narrowing, but there was another possibility they needed to consider. Mark leaned forward, dread clawing at his chest. He asked what possibility. The vet sighed heavily, his voice low and serious. Illegal wildlife trafficking. He explained that people smuggled exotic animals across borders regularly, selling them on the black market as pets to wealthy collectors. Cubs were easy to move because they were small and fetched high prices. Many did not survive the journey. Those that did often ended up abandoned when their owners realized they could not control them as they grew. The words hit Mark like a physical blow. He pictured Shadow left in a cramped cage, ripped from its mother, transported like cargo across state lines. His heart ached at the thought. He asked if the vet was saying someone had dumped Shadow deliberately. Dr. Harris nodded slowly. It would not be the first time this had happened. Traffickers often abandoned animals when authorities got too close to their operations. A roadside in the rain fit the pattern perfectly. Mark rubbed his face with trembling hands. He wanted desperately to deny it, to cling to the image of Shadow as a lost puppy, a chance encounter meant to bring them together by fate. But piece by piece, the puzzle formed a chilling picture. The strange cries, the glowing eyes, the sharp claws, it all aligned with something wild, something completely untamed. The vet's tone softened, but his words still carried heavy weight. He said he did not doubt Mark's good intentions for a moment. Mark had saved its life. But wild animals, even young cubs, did not lose their instincts. They could not be trained like dogs. Keeping one was dangerous for Mark and unfair for the animal. It belonged in the wild or in the care of specialists who knew how to raise it properly. Mark glanced at Shadow, who had climbed onto his arm, curling against him with surprising affection. The warmth of its body pressed into his chest, and his heart twisted painfully. Mark whispered with his voice breaking that Shadow seemed to need him. Dr. Harris's eyes softened with genuine sympathy. He said he understood completely, but sometimes the kindest thing they could do was let go. The room fell silent. Mark's mind whirled with conflict. Every instinct screamed to protect Shadow. Yet the vet's words echoed with undeniable reason. If Shadow really was a wolf cub or worse, some exotic predator, keeping him was not just dangerous, it was illegal. Still, questions burned in his mind. Mark asked quietly that if it was from traffickers, what happened now? Would they come looking for it? The vet hesitated, then shook his head. Most likely not, he said. If they had abandoned it, they had already cut their losses. But the authorities needed to know. They would want to investigate. If there was one cub, there could be more out there suffering. Mark's stomach tightened. The thought of other creatures out there suffering, lost, maybe dying in cages, made his chest ache. He glanced at Shadow again. The cub tilted its head, chirping softly as if sensing his turmoil. In that moment, Mark realized this was not just about him anymore. Saving Shadow had pulled him into a bigger story, one that reached beyond his home and into the shadows of greed and cruelty. Dr. Harris placed a hand on his shoulder. He said Mark had done the right thing bringing it here. But now he needed to decide what came next. Mark's heart sank. The bond he had built felt unbreakable, yet the truth loomed like a storm. Shadow was not a puppy. He never had been. And letting go might be the hardest decision of his entire life. Mark sat in his truck outside the clinic, the rain pattering softly against the windshield like a melancholy soundtrack. Shadow was curled in the carrier on the passenger seat, eyes half closed, tiny chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath. To anyone else, it was just a strange animal, a potential danger. But to Mark, it was family. His mind churned with Dr. Harris's words replaying endlessly. A predator, illegal trafficking, dangerous. None of it matched the creature he had fed, cradled and carried against his chest at night. Shadow had looked to him for safety, had pressed its little head into his palm with complete trust. How could he turn his back now? Yet, deep down, fear whispered persistently. If Shadow truly was wild, what would happen when it grew larger and stronger? Already its movements were sharper, its cries more haunting and unnatural. A pup could be trained, but a predator would follow instincts written in its blood. Could love alone be enough to change that fundamental nature? Mark's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, torn between two worlds. On one side was his heart, screaming to protect Shadow no matter the cost. On the other was responsibility, the vet's warning that the cub needed experts, not a man pretending it was a dog. He thought of the neighbors, the little girl who had pointed and called Shadow a puppy. What if the creature snapped one day? What if kindness was not enough to tame it? The dilemma weighed heavily. Keeping Shadow meant risking the safety of others, and perhaps his own. Giving him up meant breaking a bond that had already rooted itself deep inside Mark's soul. Either choice felt like losing. Shadow stirred in the carrier, letting out a soft chirp, eyes opening to meet Mark's gaze. The look was innocent, trusting, almost pleading. His chest ached. How could something so small and helpless be a threat? Mark exhaled shakily. He whispered, asking what he was supposed to do. The only answer was silence, and the knowledge that whatever choice he made, his life would never be the same. By the next day, the story had spread beyond Mark's quiet home. A neighbor who had seen Shadow through the window had snapped a photo and posted it online with the caption asking if the man had rescued a mysterious puppy. But was it really a dog? Within hours, the post went viral. The comments flooded in rapidly. Some people were charmed, commenting on how cute it was and admiring those eyes. Others were alarmed, stating that was no puppy. That was a wild animal and dangerous. The debate raged across social media platforms. Strangers were dissecting every detail of Shadow's appearance. Soon, local reporters showed up at Mark's driveway. Microphones in hand, they asked rapid-fire questions. Was it true he had been raising a wild cub? Did he know it could be dangerous? What would he do now? Mark, overwhelmed, shielded Shadow in his arms, refusing to answer any questions. The cub blinked at the cameras with eerie calm, only deepening the public fascination. Within days, the town was divided. At the grocery store, strangers approached Mark to praise him. One woman said he had saved that poor thing, squeezing his arm and calling him a hero. At the park, others whispered behind his back. They said it was irresponsible and that animal could hurt someone. Children were especially captivated. They begged their parents to drive past Mark's house, hoping to glimpse the mysterious creature in the window. To them, Shadow was not dangerous. He was a fairy tale come to life. Teachers even used the story in classrooms, sparking debates about kindness and responsibility toward wildlife. But not everyone was enchanted. Town officials grew concerned. Rumors circulated that wildlife authorities had been alerted. Some feared Shadow could be diseased. Others warned about the danger of imprinting wild animals on humans. The word confiscation began to spread, sending panic shooting through Mark's chest. The local news station aired a segment one evening. The anchor's voice was grave. A man in their community believed he rescued a puppy, but experts said it may in fact be a wild cub. Should such animals be allowed in homes? Or did compassion outweigh the risk? Clips of Shadow played on screen, his wide eyes, his strange chirping cries, leaving viewers both fascinated and deeply unsettled. Mark felt the walls closing in. The bond he shared with Shadow was private, personal, but now it had become everyone's business. Each headline, each debate chipped away at his certainty. He was no longer just a man who saved a helpless creature. He was the center of a controversy, dividing an entire town. One night, while walking Shadow in his backyard, Mark overheard neighbors arguing over the fence. One snapped that the animal did not belong in a house. If it was wild, it was dangerous. The other countered, asking if they were supposed to punish him for showing compassion. Their voices carried into the night, echoing Mark's own inner turmoil. The pressure mounted. People he had never met left notes on his doorstep. Some urging him to keep Shadow, others demanding he give the cub up immediately. A small group even gathered outside with signs reading, "Protect wildlife and safety first." The once quiet street now felt like a stage, and Mark stood at the center, every move scrutinized. Through it all, Shadow remained unchanged. He still curled against Mark's chest at night, still chirped softly when he returned home, still watched him with those haunting, knowing eyes. To Mark, he was just Shadow, small, fragile, dependent. But to the town, he had become something larger, a symbol. Some saw him as a miracle, proof of human kindness. Others saw him as a threat, proof of human recklessness. And in that divide, Mark realized something chilling. The decision of what to do with Shadow might no longer be his alone. The pressure grew unbearable. Each day, more letters arrived in Mark's mailbox. Some praising him for saving Shadow, others warning him that keeping the cub was reckless. The debate online turned into arguments on local radio, even heated discussions at town meetings. Mark could feel the walls closing in. Finally, a letter arrived that made his chest tighten. It was from the State Wildlife Authority requesting that he bring the animal in for evaluation. The paper trembled in his hands as he read it. This was no longer just a personal choice. The law was stepping in. That night, Mark sat on the living room floor, with Shadow curled in his lap. The cub purred, if it could be called that, chirping softly in his sleep. Mark's hand stroked the soft fur again and again, his throat aching. Every instinct screamed to protect him, to fight against anyone who tried to take him away. Yet Dr. Harris's words haunted him. It belonged in the wild. Keeping it was not fair to Mark or to Shadow. Mark closed his eyes, imagining Shadow months from now. Larger, stronger, instincts sharpened. Would the cub still curl against his chest, or would those instincts turn as nature demanded? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. The next morning, Mark made his decision. He packed a small bag with Shadow's towel, the flannel shirt he had first wrapped him in, and the toy he had chewed on endlessly. With each item, his heart felt heavier. Finally, he placed Shadow gently in the carrier. The cub chirped in protest, pawing at the bars, not understanding what was happening. Mark whispered that it was okay, that he was not abandoning him. He was giving him what he deserved, a chance to be free. At the Wildlife Center, officials met him with solemn expressions. Papers tentar novamente es continuo were signed, questions answered methodically. Then came the hardest part, handing over the carrier. Mark lingered, his hand pressed against the side, eyes burning with unshed tears. Shadow stared back, wide-eyed and unblinking, as if sensing the goodbye. Tears blurred Mark's vision as he whispered the final words. He thanked Shadow for letting him be part of his story. The staff carried Shadow away, and the sound of his chirps fading down the hall nearly broke Mark in two. He stood frozen, his chest hollow, yet deep inside, a quiet peace stirred. He had done the right thing. For the first time, Mark understood that sometimes love meant holding on, but sometimes it meant letting go. The days after saying goodbye were heavy with silence that pressed down on Mark like a physical weight. Mark's house felt emptier than ever before. The absence of tiny chirps and wide, watchful eyes echoing in every corner of every room. He caught himself glancing at the shoebox bed he had once made with such care, or listening for claws tapping softly against the floor. But the space remained still and lifeless. And yet, despite the ache in his chest that felt like a constant companion, Mark knew deep down he had made the right choice. Shadow was no longer trapped between two worlds, domesticated yet wild, never truly belonging to either. He was in the hands of experts with a real chance to grow as he was meant to, not as a pet, not as someone's secret, but as a creature of nature, free to fulfill the life he was born for. Mark often thought back to that rainy night on the roadside that had changed everything. He had believed he was rescuing a helpless puppy in desperate need. In truth, he had stumbled into a far bigger story, one about the delicate line between kindness and responsibility. He had learned that compassion was more than simply saving something. It was making choices that sometimes broke your heart into pieces. The town eventually quieted down as new stories took center stage. The debates faded from social media and local news. But the story of the man who thought he saved a puppy lived on in different ways. Schools used it as a lesson about wildlife conservation and the importance of proper animal care. Families told it as a reminder not to judge by appearances alone. And to Mark, it remained something deeper and more personal, a reminder that life could surprise us in ways we never expected. On quiet evenings, he still walked the same road where he first found Shadow. Sometimes he imagined hearing that tiny squeak again in the darkness, seeing wide eyes glinting in the dark grass beside the road. A part of him would always miss the little creature that had curled into his chest, trusting him completely and without reservation. But another part of him took comfort in knowing he had given Shadow what mattered most: a future. In the end, Shadow's story was not just about an animal found abandoned on a roadside. It was about the choices we make when faced with responsibility. It was about love, sacrifice, and the courage to let go of something precious. And as Mark stood beneath the same storm-cooled sky where it all began, he whispered softly to himself, "Sometimes the scariest truths bring the most important lessons." The Wildlife Center had kept Mark updated occasionally in those first few weeks after he surrendered Shadow. They told him the cub was adjusting well to its new environment, that it was eating properly and showing natural behaviors. They explained that Shadow would eventually be moved to a specialized sanctuary where he could live among his own kind, where experts could give him the life he deserved. Mark took comfort in these updates, though each one came with a bittersweet sting. He was grateful Shadow was safe and cared for, yet the separation felt like a wound that would not quite heal. One afternoon, several weeks after saying goodbye, Mark received a phone call that made his heart skip. It was from the wildlife authorities. They had traced the origins of Shadow and wanted to share what they had discovered. Mark listened intently as they explained that Shadow was indeed a wolf cub, but not from any local population. Through genetic testing and investigation, they had determined he was part of an illegal breeding operation that had been smuggling exotic wolf hybrids across state lines. The operation had been shut down weeks before Mark found Shadow, and the animals had been scattered in the chaos. Shadow had likely been abandoned deliberately by someone fleeing the authorities. The news hit Mark hard. Shadow had not just been lost. He had been a victim of human greed and cruelty. The authorities went on to explain that Mark's decision to bring Shadow in had helped them locate 2 other cubs from the same operation, both of which were now safe in protective care. His act of kindness had rippled outward, saving more lives than just the one he had held in his arms that rainy night. Mark felt tears prick his eyes. He had done more than he knew. As weeks turned into months, Mark slowly adjusted to life without Shadow. The house no longer felt quite so empty, though he kept the flannel shirt he had first wrapped Shadow in folded carefully in a drawer. It served as a tangible reminder of the bond they had shared, however brief. He found himself volunteering at a local wildlife education center, sharing his story with visitors who came to learn about native animals. He spoke honestly about his mistakes, about how he had let emotion cloud judgment, about the importance of calling experts when you found wild animals. His story resonated with people. Parents brought their children to hear him speak. Teachers invited him to classrooms. Mark realized that Shadow's legacy was not just about one cub saved, but about education and awareness that could prevent similar situations in the future. One spring afternoon, nearly a year after that fateful rainy night, Mark received an unexpected package in the mail. Inside was a photo taken at the sanctuary where Shadow now lived. The image showed a magnificent young wolf, sleek and powerful, standing on a rocky outcrop with others of his kind. His coat gleamed in the sunlight, his eyes bright and alert. On the back of the photo, someone had written a simple message: "Shadow is thriving. Thank you for giving him a chance." Mark stared at the photo for a long time, tears streaming down his face. This was not the tiny, trembling creature he had scooped from the wet grass. This was a wild animal in its element, strong and free. This was what Shadow was always meant to become. He placed the photo on his mantel where he could see it every day. It served as a reminder of the journey they had taken together, of the lessons learned, of the difficult choice that had ultimately been the right one. Mark no longer felt the sharp sting of loss when he thought of Shadow. Instead, he felt pride that he had been strong enough to let go, pride that Shadow was living the life nature intended. Pride that his moment of compassion on a rainy roadside had made a real difference. Friends and family noticed the change in Mark. He seemed more thoughtful, more aware of the complexity of kindness. He spoke often about the balance between helping and interfering, about respecting the wildness in wild things. His experience with Shadow had transformed him in ways he was still discovering. He became an advocate for wildlife protection, speaking at community events about the dangers of illegal animal trafficking. He worked with local schools to develop programs teaching children how to respond when they encountered wild animals. He partnered with veterinarians to create networks for reporting suspected trafficking cases. The town that had once been divided over Shadow's presence now came together around the lessons his story had taught. The controversy faded, replaced by a collective understanding that compassion required wisdom. People began calling wildlife authorities when they found animals rather than taking them home. The local shelter created a wildlife hotline specifically for such situations. Shadow's impact extended far beyond his own rescue. He had become a catalyst for change in how the entire community approached wildlife encounters. Mark never forgot the feel of Shadow's tiny body curled against his chest, the sound of those strange chirps, the way those enormous eyes had looked at him with what seemed like understanding. Those memories remained precious, untarnished by time, but they no longer carried the weight of regret. Instead, they carried gratitude for the brief time they had shared, gratitude for the lessons learned, gratitude for the opportunity to make a difference, even when that difference required personal sacrifice. Years passed, and the story of the man who thought he saved a puppy became part of local legend. New families moving into town would hear about it, would ask questions, would seek out Mark to hear the tale firsthand. He never tired of telling it, though he always emphasized the same key points. Always call experts. Always consider what is best for the animal, not what feels best for you. Always remember that wild things belong to the wild. These lessons, born from his experience with Shadow, became his legacy to the community. Mark often wondered if Shadow remembered him. Did the wolf ever think back to those early days in a warm house, being fed milk from a dish, sleeping on a human pillow? Or had those memories faded completely, replaced by the instincts and experiences of life in the wild? Mark hoped, in a way, that Shadow had forgotten. It meant he had fully returned to his true nature, unburdened by the confusion of those early weeks. At the same time, a small, selfish part of Mark hoped that somewhere in Shadow's wild heart there remained a flicker of recognition, a sense of the bond they had shared. On the anniversary of finding Shadow, Mark always returned to that same stretch of road. He would park his truck in the exact spot where he had pulled over that rainy night, and he would stand in the grass where he had first seen those enormous eyes reflecting in his headlights. The ritual brought him peace. It connected him to that moment of choice, that decision to stop and help. He never regretted stopping. Even knowing what he knew now, even understanding the complications that had followed, he would always stop. The difference was that now he would make a different choice, about what came next. Standing there on the roadside, Mark would think about all the lives touched by one small creature. The other cubs rescued because of Shadow, the children educated about wildlife, the community brought together by a shared lesson, the trafficking operations shut down, all of it traced back to one rainy night and one act of imperfect kindness. It reminded Mark that our actions ripple outward in ways we cannot always predict or control. What matters is the intention behind them and the willingness to correct course when we realize we have made mistakes. As the sun set on another anniversary, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Mark whispered a quiet thank you to the universe for bringing Shadow into his life, however briefly. He thanked Shadow for teaching him about the complexity of compassion. He thanked the veterinarian who had the courage to tell him the truth. He thanked the wildlife experts who had given Shadow a second chance at his true life. And he thanked himself for being strong enough to let go when letting go was the hardest thing he had ever done. The story of Shadow ended not with sadness, but with hope. Hope that more people would learn to balance their hearts with their heads. Hope that fewer wild animals would suffer in captivity. Hope that communities would come together to protect the creatures that shared their world. Shadow was not just a wolf cub found on a roadside. He was a teacher, a catalyst, a symbol of what it means to truly care for something beyond yourself. And Mark was not just a man who made a mistake. He was someone who learned, grew, and used his experience to make the world a little bit better. As Mark drove home that evening, the same road that had once brought him to Shadow now carried him forward into a future shaped by the lessons of the past. The rain had stopped long ago, but the memory of that wet, trembling creature remained crystal clear. It would remain with him always, not as a source of pain, but as a reminder of the beautiful, complicated, challenging nature of true compassion. Sometimes the scariest truths do indeed bring the most important lessons. And sometimes letting go is the greatest act of love we can offer.